lots of online events like you have. Yeah. And obviously, you know, I'll be honest with you, I'm burnt out.
You're very good at it.
Yeah.
I can't afford to be yet.
No,
Christmas I'll be burnt out, but not yet.
but I tell you, I'm enjoying creating a small domestic cocoon that insulates me
Yes.
from the world. I've been making some sourdough bread.
Oh, okay.
So if you want any sourdough starter, I can that's what I've been looking on my editing phone.
But you're also working.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Black History Month, I've been doing a lot of stuff on Zoom. And then, you know, I've been working on some ideas, but I don't know if I want the public to see them.
What's that? Are you working on another book?
There's nothing, I've not signed on any dotted lines. I don't know if what I'm writing might be another book. I don't know, maybe. But I'm like doing just experimenting with my writing and stuff at the minute, so.
One-off pieces from magazines and newspapers and stuff.
Not even that. I'm keeping it very private.
It's good. That's really good. Yeah.
Trying to own it for myself.
What about you? Just pay the bills at the
Pretty much, which is beyond my wildest dreams.
Have you started doing this? You start writing and you start thinking. Teach at the same time and you start teaching. And they're quite good about.
Yeah, no, I arranged it when I got shortlisted for the Booker. I went to see them, the Dean,
Oh, that's
and
very
said,
wise.
right, okay, I want a sabbatical, really long sabbatical, and he gave it to me. So, yeah.
Well, they must love the kudos and the gravitas and, you know,
Yeah.
rubs off on them.
And also, I kind of, I don't know if you know about academia, but the way it operates, you have to ask.
Good evening, welcome to Black History Month in conversation with, and I'm really pleased, I'm going to try not to behave like a fanboy here because I've got two brilliant Londoners joining me today for the In Conversation with two brilliant Londoners, two brilliant women and two brilliant black women as well. And I've told them both before we've begun that I'm a fanboy, and I got their books. I got Bernardine's book before Obama read your book, I hasten to add. I got to tell you, Reni, your book was given to me by my eldest daughter, who's undergraduate. I got to tell you this though, when you read your book on the tube, you do get some stares.
I've definitely heard this, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you're getting even more stared down.
Yeah, for those that don't know, it's called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. But can I welcome you all to this really special In Conversation with two brilliant Londoners. Now, I want to kick things off with some gentle questions. Some questions have been emailed in, which I'll ask you about. But one of the things that we try and do in City Hall during October is to educate ourselves about Black history, to re-educate ourselves about Black history, but to celebrate Black success. And my Deputy Mayor, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, who's organised this evening, she spends a lot of time in advance of October organising the month, and it's, in my view, the best month of the year. But I want to ask you, Bernardine, first, what does Black History Month mean to you? What did it mean to you growing up, if anything? And what do you think we should try and do during this month of October?
Yeah, well, growing up, there was no Black History Month because I go way back. And also, there was no Black history to study either. I mean, it's shocking that today school students are still not really studying Black history. But I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and there was a complete absence of Black history in terms of knowing anything about my father's Nigerian culture, or anything about African American culture, or anything about Africa generally, or the Caribbean. And I think, you know, it was a gap, an absence in my life, even though I didn't realize it at the time, because the thing about Black history is it gives you a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. And my feeling about Black History Month today, and I think a lot of people share this, is that it really should be Black History Year, right? You know, we kind of allocate this month to it, but really it's something that should be just completely integrated into our lives. And I think of Black British history as British history. You know, it is British history. If you look at British history and you go back 500 years, and you go back to slavery, you go back to colonialism, and then you go back to, you know, the 20th century, then you are looking at a really important part of British history. So it is completely integrated, and it's, in a sense, it's a shame that we have to section it off to draw attention to it, because people don't regard it as British history, but it is British history.
Do you intentionally, through your stories, try and tell that British history, Black history? One of your characters in your most recent award-winning book, the 90-year-old, I mean, her history, her story is fascinating, but you then are reminded about the history of slavery, and I don't want to give it away, and what happens towards the end, the sort of arc. Was that intentional to try and educate the ignorant reader, small I, about some of our history?
Yeah, not really. I don't really see myself as somebody who's an educator, as a writer, because the creative process isn't really about educating. It's about telling stories. And, you know, I'm very focused on telling stories from a Black British perspective about the African diaspora in all kinds of ways. And in Girl, Woman, Other, it spans over 100 years, about 120 years. And so I go back into Victorian England, and I have one character who's actually born in Victorian England, because we know there was a presence of Black people in Victorian Britain. But actually, in my other books, I have explored Black history in different ways. So my third book, The Emperor's Babe, is about a Black girl who grows up in Roman London nearly 2,000 years ago, called Zuleika. Actually, in this we're in City Hall, in this area. And I've also got a book called Soul Tourists, and these are fiction, you know, they're novels, and it's about the Black history of Europe, and all these ghosts of colour from European history come into the life of one of the characters. So Black history and my fiction is really important.
Now, I've got to confess, Reni, when I read your book, I was embarrassed that I'd forgotten about some of the recent history. You talk about the laws, you talk about some of the recent things that have happened to you know, Black Londoners, Black British people. So presumably Black History Month gives you a platform to tell these stories in a way that's meaningful to not just Black people, but people who aren't Black as well.
I think when I started to sort of write the book, and I was a child of the 90s, so I think I came of age in a different Britain. I came of age, you know, when I was like 7 years old, when we had the Labour election, that my parents were, you know, hollering and whooping and celebrating and whatnot. So I came of age in a time when, like, we were celebrating this idea of multiculturalism. But that being said, you know, so I went to school and I did have Black History Months, but it focused, like, pretty much exclusively on African American history. So I felt this kind of like weird schism, like, I'm a child of the 90s, I'm going to school, like, we're celebrating multiculturalism in all of these different ways, but we didn't really have, like, access to recent histories that would, like Bernardine says, like, you know, give a sense of place, give reasoning for the belonging, because at the same time, you know, we'd also be on the receiving end of questions like, well, where are you from? Where are you really from? And I mean, I knew where I was from anecdotally. I knew that, you know, my grandparents had, you know, come to Britain while Nigeria was, you know, still, you know, in part of the British Empire, you know, and that they settled in Yorkshire, and that I had, you know, family members who were born around Yorkshire, you know, Leeds and Ilkley, and then they'd come down to London, you know, like in the 60s. So I knew that, but that wasn't reflected in like how we were learning, you know, Black history in school. It was like those like migration stories and how they were linked to the British Empire wasn't something that was reflected in our understanding of like what Black history was in school, which I think then led to this kind of like, as you sort of said, small eye ignorance of, you know, my peers would be saying, well, where are you really from? You know, like almost as if, well, if you're not white, but you're also British, like people can't place you. So I suppose you know, there were political arguments that I wanted to make in the book that I felt just couldn't be made without anchoring at least some recent history. And in the writing of that recent history, like going through the archives and stuff, like I went to the British Library, I went to the Black Cultural Archives, and you know, it was as much as a learning journey for me as it was like any of my readers. And I think when I speak to readers who, you know, lived through those times, I wondered to myself, why aren't those stories in our understanding of like what modern Britain is, like why modern Britain is the way it is, you know?
I mean, one of the things that in your book you talk about is we're approaching Remembrance Day. We remember those who have fallen, and the amazing numbers you talk about of those who are Black and also from the subcontinent who served in the First World War and the Second World War, who until very recently no one talked about.
Absolutely.
I mean, when I grew up, nobody talked about this, but your book talks about how, you know, it's a fact, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, you know, it's that, I mean, I think that as a country, we need to really get to grips with the fact that like Britain's always been a very outward facing country. You know, I think empire is a proof of that, which means that, you know, when it came to those world wars, there were people all over the world fighting on behalf of Britain. And actually, when I was doing that research about the world wars, that fundamentally changed my thoughts around poppy wearing. Like fundamentally, I'm somebody now, after doing that research, I'm wearing a poppy. Before I used to think like, sometimes it felt like poppy wearing was like pulled into this like culture war argument. But you know, after I did that research and I really understood the scale of how many people basically across the Commonwealth, you know, put their lives on the line in those wars, I was like, I'm now a poppy wearer, you know?
Can I say one thing that's amazing, and it's brilliant the awards you've both won, it really is, but I sort of grown up with my mates being told, and me being told, Black doesn't sell. So if you want to be a successful lawyer, being Black, you won't get clients, or you can't win votes being Black. You were number one in the fiction paperback list. You were number one in the non-fiction charts. Firstly, how did it feel? And what was the response to, not your publishers, because I'm sure they're great, but others in the industry, you being number one, and what did you do to celebrate?
Oh, drink, of course. Lots of bubbly, any old excuse. I was really shocked, actually. I mean,
oh, you were really?
I was really shocked because when I won the Booker, I knew a Black woman hadn't won the Booker. I knew that. But I didn't know that a Black woman hadn't topped the fiction paperback charts. And so, and I can name a number of people I thought would have hit that spot, and they hadn't. And so for me, it was very sobering, because I realized, well, I know anyway that the publishing industry it's an economy, right? And it's about book sales as much as the quality of the literature. And actually the books that keep the industry, the wheels of the industry turning are the commercial books. And of course I'm a literary fiction writer. And then to realize that we hadn't sold enough to hit that particular spot was really shocking. And I think what it meant to me was that the publishing industry we know that they have to open up not only in terms of the people they employ, but also in terms of the books that they publish.
Yeah.
But they need to publish books in every kind of genre. And this is my mantra at the moment, because they have published some non-fiction and some literary fiction. But generally speaking, they don't publish in all the genres that really sell, like crime and thriller and horror and so on. And just to say, Reni was, I think for 1 week, the best-selling author of all genres. And that had never happened before. Is that right?
For first, I think, Black British.
First Black British person.
Yeah, I mean, the only other Black person I think had done it was Michelle Obama.
Yeah.
Which is
Never heard
wild.
of her. What was brilliant about both of your achievements was, I really love, you just mentioned it now, Bernardine, but one of the quotes I saw from you was you name-checked so many Black authors, and you mentioned that you were standing on their shoulders and stuff. And I'm like you, I can't believe no one's done it before. You know, we're in 2020, and it's sort of, you still think, you sort of, no. But I mean, it must have felt like particularly bearing in mind the title of your book. You're talking about some pretty crunchy, challenging things, but as Bernardine said, it can be commercially successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we have to say about the charts is that I believe that the charts have only been in existence since like the turn of the millennium, right? So there is a possibility that a Black British author may have, you know, hit those marks. You reckon not?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? I mean, because I'm trying to do it down, basically.
Can I just say,
it can't be me.
You're doing down your achievement, Rennie.
You see, I've been around not much longer than you, and I can't think of who.
If I was your spin doctor, I wouldn't allow you to have said that, by the way.
Well, I just feel like, you know, Why I'm, which is my nickname for it because it's like 10 words long, that title. Not saying that's a regret, but it's a mouthful. But Why I'm, you know, it's my first book, you know. I'm very new to publishing. And so, I mean, I don't want to like do down like the quality of the book, but it wouldn't have been the book it is without all of the, you know, Black British authors so I'd read, you know, years before I even thought that it was possible for me to write a book. And so I really thought, to some extent, I kind of like every author I name-checked, including you, Bernardine.
Yeah,
I was like, these are people who should have really...
Can I say, it was lovely to see. Because what's great about both of you is you aren't pulling the ladder up. What's quite clear is you're putting more ladders down, and that's what's inspirational. And that's why we're so proud and pleased to have you having this conversation. But one thing that both of you have had to deal with, and it's been traumatic for many Black Londoners, Black people across the globe, is the brutal killing of George Floyd, the disproportionate way this pandemic has affected the Black communities across the globe. Now, both of you have been quite upfront saying, listen, we aren't self-appointed Black role models and all the rest of it, but you've both carried the responsibility so well, if you don't mind me saying so. How hard has it been? How easy has it been? How challenging has it been? How do you deal with that? Because whether you like it or not, many young people, Black people, do see you, both of you, as role models, as spokespeople, even though you've not asked to be one, even though you've not been appointed by anybody. How do you carry that? How do you deal with that?
I completely accept it as it's really important that I take on that responsibility. And you know, I started writing for theatre professionally in 1982. So actually, the journey I've led to get into this stage in my career has taken 40 years, right? And suddenly, in the past year, everything has changed because of the Booker. So I know what it's like to be outside of the centre, and I know what it's like to come up against all kinds of obstacles as a writer, as a theatre maker, just as a Black woman negotiating my space in a majority white country. And at the same time, I come from a very political family. My father was a socialist. He was a Labour councillor, first Black Labour councillor in Greenwich in the 70s. My mother was a trade union rep. And it was always about the greater good. It was always about taking other people with you. And that's something that I've carried throughout the whole of my career. It's just that people have realized that I've been doing it because I have a much larger platform. But I think, I'm not saying that all artists or all writers have to take that on as a responsibility, because why should they? White writers are not having to represent anybody but themselves often. But I take it on, and actually, it gives me great pleasure. It's part of the pleasure of the success I have at the moment is that I can share my platform with a lot of, especially the new writers coming up right now.
And one of the things, before I get to Reni, is one of the great things you do is help mainstream an issue that could, if we're not careful, be seen as a peripheral issue because of you know, the people you mingle with now, who you roll with now. You can mainstream this issue, which I think is a huge benefit to those of us who believe passionately about this.
Yeah. Well, years ago, I would tweet things and they would just disappear without trace and get about 10 likes. And now they have a chance to go viral. And we know social media is a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, definitely people are listening to what I have to say now. Yeah.
And your book, actually, it was written before George Floyd's brutal killing. It was written before Black Lives Matter, the movement, and before it was a mainstream issue. But actually, luckily, you'd done the homework and you could talk about this so fluently. I mean, how do you feel about the responsibility that's been thrust upon you as the author of this book that everyone's reading? And it must be quite stressful as well.
I felt, I think, very conflicted at the time. I think particularly when the book went to #1, about the circumstances that led to that. Even though I think that, you know, I think both of our work, there could have been a time when publishing said that it wasn't going to be commercial, like that our work might not be considered bestsellers. So I felt conflicted because, you know, obviously I'm pleased that the work is reaching a wider audience, but I'm dismayed at the circumstances that suddenly got people sitting up straight and being like, oh my God, I need to read more into this. I think that, you know, again, this is a matter of standing on the shoulders of giants. I think that there has been work done for years, for decades, infrastructure that has been set up. You know, Bernardine's work is part of it, that, you know, has meant that at a time of essentially, you know, it was a point of global crisis, no doubt about it. What with the pandemic and then also, you know, a huge reckoning on Black lives, that people needed resources. And I felt very fortunate that my book could be one of those resources that people felt that they could reach for and recommend to friends when people were suddenly, you know, shocked and felt that they needed to understand a little bit more about why this was happening, like what racial inequality looked like. And I did an interview I think it was for British Vogue, you know, soon after that moment, in which I said, you know, there have been people working, underappreciated, you know, unsung heroes doing that infrastructure for a long time now. When I think back to, you know, the inklings of the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2012, when seriously, he was simply just a young boy, Trayvon Martin was shot. You know, people have been doing that organizing work. People have been doing that big picture abstract thinking work for, you know, in the latest iteration of the movement, you know, close to a decade, but even much longer than that. So to me, like, the fact that it's suddenly global and so many people have sat up is really testament to all of that work. And I'm glad to be a part of it, I really am.
Just to say that, you know, it has been a catalyst for change in this country, and that's really interesting. You know, like you say, they have sat up, and for example, in our industry, the publishing industry, lots of Black writers are being commissioned and they're buying the books in a way that they haven't before. Mm-hmm. So, and we have to obviously make sure this is sustained forever. But yeah, it has been an amazing catalyst.
And I don't know about you, Bernardine, but I remember when I was like first working around the ideas for this book, I received feedback and I was told it's too ambitious. You know, it's
from the publishers and from
you know, from prospective publishers, you know, it's too ambitious a scope that you want to go for here. And you know, the ideas that I pitched at the time, they're not that different from, you know, what's ended up in the finished product. And I don't know. I mean, when I started, you know, writing what would become the book, I was, you know, almost like buoyed by the naivety of youth. I was like, yes, this is going to be a big picture, like conversation-changing book.
And it was.
And I know, right? Like I went to publishers.
Those
and I was
of us who spent 40 years getting there, we hate you.
I was like, I want to fundamentally change the conversation. And you know, sometimes I was told, the idea of that is just simply too ambitious. And so I think everything that, like, we've been encouraged to think small and dream small and we've been told, like, okay, yeah, obviously we'd like to be at that place with society at some point, but that's absolutely not possible now. But I think that this summer has shown that that's not the case. We can dream big.
Bernardine touched something really important in relation to our white peers, but even in relation to our black peers, sometimes there's a temptation not to put your head above the parapet. It ain't good for business. But you are way out there in relation to your title speaks for itself. The issues you're talking about are quite challenging and quite crunchy, particularly in other protected characteristics. Your chapter on feminism is fantastic on
Thank you.
on intersectionality and some of the tensions there are. Did you ever think, for a first book, I'm not sure if this is a bit too bold, were you not advised to be, you mentioned being less ambitious, but to be less, I don't want to use that adversarial, but...
Oh, sometimes I think I was told once, tone it down.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I say about the title, and I always said this like from day one of publication, that, you know, considering the blog post that the title came from, I was like, this is so emotionally exhausting. I was like, I will talk to white people about anything, EastEnders, their pets, holiday, anything, just not this topic, because I don't think I can hack it anymore. And what I tried to do with that original blog post was really like, you know, elucidate why I had to draw that boundary for myself, right? Do I still feel the same? Well, I think the first line of that blog post, which is, you know, not all white people, just people who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I'm happy to say I think the needle has changed on that. I think there's a lot more people who are willing to accept that there is legitimacy in evidence-based claims of structural racism, which is amazing, because then I'm like, yeah, sure, I'm more open to having that conversation. I think one thing that I think is really important to like point out when it comes to my story is that I graduated into a recession. I was a jobbing journalist, like freelancing prior to the book coming out. There was no security, you know. I could take risks because I had basically nothing to protect, you know, like, there was no full-time job, there was no mortgage, there was no dependents, there were none of these things. And, you know, the job market wasn't exactly forthcoming in, you know, providing that security, which meant that, like, I kind of had nothing to lose. So I think it's not that I was like, I mean, for me, like, the book is very much, I try to make it as evidence-based as possible. It wasn't me attempting to try and be provocative. It was me just trying to, I guess, tell it like it is.
No, I use arguments from here all the time, by the way. They work. Can I just say, Bernardine, one of the things I loved about your book, many things, I recognise in my mates the investment banker. My daughters, my nieces and their mates are the undergraduates. I recognise the artistic director. It's almost like, you know, but it's also a book full of hope. Now, you mentioned your family background, which I know a bit about, your dad and your mum. One of the things that I think can give hope is, without being rose-tinted, but the progress of your life in relation to what life was like in South London when you grew up, versus now you've been a Booker Prize winner and a chart topper. Just for those of us those people who watch it, who are, you know, who think it's doom and gloom, I mean, are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. I also have doses of cynicism sort of lurking around, but actually I think we always have to acknowledge the progress we've made in this society over the past century. We just have to acknowledge that, and often we don't, because we know that sometimes it feels like, in terms of race, we're in crisis in this country, especially when you look at the statistics, you know, of imprisonment, or, you know, the number of black women professors, of which I'm one, and there are hardly any of us, or the judiciary, or whatever. So we always feel as if we're kind of beleaguered and we're not developing and not moving as a nation, but we totally have, because, you know, before 1976 it was legal to be racist, and people were, you know, and they were towards my family when I was growing up. And my father came from Nigeria in 1949, and he had a terrible time, and my family, a mixed race family, had a terrible time. And so over the decades we have seen progress. I grew up at a time where there were no black people on British television. None at all. I remember the first black person I saw in 1974, Angela Bruce, Coronation Street. Look at it now. Look at the BBC in particular. It's very multiracial. So we have to acknowledge the ways in which a society has progressed, but we also have to acknowledge that we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, one of the issues that I think is a problem is that it's always us. We're always having to progress the cause, people of colour, when it comes in terms of race relations. And it should be. We should all be on board with this. No matter what colour you are, we should all be looking towards creating a more egalitarian society for everybody. And, you know, perhaps that's starting to happen, you know, this notion of allyship, which has been circulating recently. And it's not even, I think, about people claiming their racism. I don't even know if that's useful, because people become very defensive when you start talking about racism or personal racism or unconscious bias. What I think it's about active anti-racism. Are you committed to that, and what are you going to do, and how are you going to progress it?
One of the things that's this summer has helped shine a light on is the racism and inequality across the globe that black people suffer. Even there's been progress. Bernardine referred to something that I want to talk to you about, Reni, because there's a bit of it in your book in relation to the tension, and it's Bernardine's point about coalition building. Mm-hmm. How do we get, you know, whether it's black people, Muslims, women, the LGBTQ plus community, and on this sort of coalition helping each other's causes, which is really important if we're going to get to a society where there is equality in the real sense of the word. I mean, what's the way forward?
I think this is a really good question, and this is kind of like where my ideas are going, you know, at the moment, which is I was very, very inspired by the writings and the speeches of he was a very young Black Panther who was like assassinated in his early 20s, I think surnamed Hampton. And he said something that actually Martin Luther King Jr. also sort of said during the time in his activism, which was essentially about coalition building and about, it was specifically around the idea of what it means to be white and working class. And I tackle this a bit in the book. And basically how the whiteness in that phrase can be leveraged sometimes to try and discredit anti-racist efforts. And what the young Black Panther did, and also what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Spoke of, was coalition building specifically in order to, I don't know how to describe this, like recognize our mutual, I guess, class interests, because I think both of those thinkers and writers very accurately identified that it was racism that was being leveraged between the two kind of communities in order to sort of sow division. And so I'm really inspired by thinking around those topics, and I know that it might be perceived as if I'm not interested in coalition building, but I think that my chapter on class in the book, what I'm really trying to get to the root of there is that those of us who, are not upper class, we have a lot more in common, and we have to recognize that racism is being leveraged in order to, I guess, sow division and mistrust, I think. So I'm personally very interested in coalition building, but I do think that it has to come with an understanding of okay, we need to divest from, structural discrimination in order for that coalition building to be successful. Otherwise, there's always going to be underlying bubbling up resentments, and that's really what I tried to tackle in my chapter on feminism as well. I'm always going to be a feminist. I might not always love the priorities of high-profile feminist campaigns, but I'll always stand up for women's reproductive rights. I'll always stand up for, I'll always stand up on, against sexual violence, because, there's women who are Black,
Yeah. Look, I've got to go to questions from people watching this, otherwise I'll get people waving at me and stuff, which either means I'm doing something wrong, which normally is the case, or I've got to go to the questions. So there's some quick fire questions, I'm told. First one's to you, Bernardine. Who is your favourite character from Girl, Women and Other? And it's asked by Daksha Wanza.
Yes, well, there are 12 characters. and main characters. And
There's not going to be do I have to do a spoiler alert?
No,
Okay.
no. There's a 19-year-old called Hattie, probably your daughter's generation, who's, I love her. I find her very funny and very entertaining. I wrote her myself, but she still entertains me.
I feel sorry for her dad, by the way. He gets a hard time.
Yeah, he deserves
Us dads do.
He deserves to be taken down a peg or two, her dad. And so, yeah, I feel a lot of affection for her, but also for Hattie, who is the 93-year-old woman of colour who's a farmer in the north of England and very independent, very feisty, and just, I love her. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, and for those that haven't read it, I mean, the 93-year-old character really does, I don't want to spoil the end, but it's very great arc. Reni, this is a great question from Jocelyn Hogan. You wrote, why am I no longer talking to white people about race? Do you have any regrets writing a book which had the opposite effect?
No, I think I drew a boundary for myself when I wrote that blog post back in 2014, but I have been, delightfully, surprised and, basically delighted at how open people are to having these difficult conversations. And like I said earlier, I do think the needle has shifted. I think that people are more open to having these conversations now than ever than back in 2014. So I don't regret it.
Can I was speaking to Debbie, my deputy mayor, Debbie Wicks-Bernard before, and I can't remember ever having a black lecturer at university or a black lecturer at law school. And I had a couple at secondary school, went to a comp in South London. How common is it now having fellow professors who look like you in higher education?
It's a problem. It's a problem. I don't know about the other academic ranks, but in terms of professors, there are about 20,000 professors in this country. And that's very distinct to American professors, because American, if you're an academic, you're a professor. But here, it's the top tier, top rank. So there are about 20,000. And out of those 20,000, about 25 are black women. Right, I'm one of them. And about 80 are black men. There are many more Asian people who are professors. So that tells you, it gives you an indication of what the landscape looks like for university students and who's teaching them. Yeah. And that also kind of shapes the curriculum to a certain extent as well.
Well, that leads to the question, which was the reason I asked. The question from Sheila Grace is to both of you, really. She says, I love your books, Bernardine and Reni. I learned so much, thank you. You've set me on a trail of reading history and fiction on race and racism. How do you think that we can get this to be part of teaching British and European history and literature?
Well, I'm not really involved in the kind of activism around that, but we know that, we've had some stats recently that tell us that you can actually go through the whole of your secondary and primary education and maybe not even study a book about a black person or about black history. So it's a problem, and there are people who are working on that. But the government needs to shift. Actually, my publisher, and your publisher, no, you're not with Penguin.
No, I'm with Bloomsbury.
Yeah, Bloomsbury. So Penguin are currently working with the Runnymede Trust, actually, on research into that. Research into the curriculum and into looking at how out of that research they can start to create reading lists and teaching materials to go into schools so that some of that issue is redressed.
Same question?
I totally agree. I would say at the minute, nationally, it's not looking good, based on the speech that the Equalities Minister gave about a week ago. It's not looking good. So I would say if people are really interested in having, the youngsters in their lives, read around, fiction by black authors, non-fiction by black authors, it might have to be supplementary to education.
Bernardine and I mean, I'm not sure about you, but a lot of the black history I know is self-taught, self-read. I mean, your book's a good example, the fiction's a good example, whether it's Afua, David. I mean, there are now authors who are writing to educate many of us who just don't know about our black history.
Actually, David Odoshoga, he's published this year a sort of young people's version of Black and British with pictures. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's great.
Definitely. So I think it's going to have to be supplementary for now.
I think so.
Until we have a government that's perhaps more interested in, putting a bit of a fuller understanding of British history on the curriculum. Don't think it's going to happen for a while, though.
Now, this actually, I'll start with you in the next question, Reni, which is from KKN. I'm not sure why I can't foresee the full name. And the question is, what are the author's views on the term BAME for those that aren't aware? It's Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic.
Well, I know that sometimes it can be kind of contested. Personally, I think as a writer, I just use the term that the most people could understand at any given time. So when I was writing the book, but also I came from an activist sensibility. So when I was writing the book in activist circles at the time, people were using the term people of color to describe people who weren't white. And I didn't want to just write non-white in the book because I felt like, well, that sounds like an absence or a deficiency or something. I don't like the idea of that. So I was like, okay, I'll go with this phrase because I felt like BAME was a phrase that it felt like it wasn't in common parlance at the time. So I don't really have any strong feelings, but in my writing, I just try to use terms and phrases that I think most people will understand.
I mean, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic is a really useful umbrella for those of us that aren't white, and it's really important. But the downside is something you refer to, Bernardine, which is it can mask the racism and inequality amongst some parts of this really important coalition. So the stat you gave, which is a fascinating one, I wasn't aware of that, Black professors. Now, if we use the phrase, by the way, I'm somebody who's an advocate of BAME, but the problem is if I ask you the question, how many BAME professors there are, you can give an answer that's quite impressive. But it masks the lack of Black professors, which you refer to and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's sort of a tension, isn't there, between...
Yeah, I mean, we need these terms that are some kind of shorthand, but at the same time, that term conflates too many identities into its name. My feeling is a bit like Reni in that these terms are always evolving. I was half caste when I was growing up. Then I was mixed race. I think now I'm biracial. My dad was Negro, which actually wasn't an insult back then. It's not really an insult now, to be honest. It's just a sort of old-fashioned historical term. And then we were coloured, and that coloured suddenly wasn't acceptable, but actually people of colour is acceptable, and I quite like people of colour because I'm a writer and it's quite poetic. So I think these terms are constantly changing, and BME, of course, is another term. But you're absolutely right. I think the reason people don't like it is because it does hide some of the iniquities in our society.
So when I was growing up, I called myself Black because if you weren't white, you were Black. It was a political phrase used. And then it went to, I think, Asian, then around Rushdie, it was the Rushdie affair, it was Muslim, and then I was BAME, I think, or BME first, then BAME and stuff. But I really like both your answers about the evolution of the description. I mean, how do you, and again, your book talks about the multiple identities we have, and actually in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of other issues. How would you identify yourself? I called you at the beginning, and apologies, you're a successful Londoner, you're both successful women, you're both successful Black women who are Londoners. I mean, how do you...
Okay, so I would really be a Londoner first and foremost, really, like above everything. And I think I say that because I've had the incredible privilege to be able to travel the world with this book, pre-COVID, and I just feel like there's a distinct way of living here and a distinct way of relating to one another that I've not been able to find anywhere else. And so, sometimes I might say Black British, but I would say, first and foremost, I am a Londoner. But I mean, outside of that, I'm just Reni. I mean, ultimately, I think particularly when it comes to
award-winning chart topping.
Yes, that too. But I think particularly when it comes to characteristic identifiers, I say this in the book, they're externally imposed. I think, I'm a black person as a neutral descriptor, but you know, as I say in the book, like I was born into the meaning of what it means to be black, kind of against my will. I feel like most of my adult life has been trying to work out, oh my God, there's all this social meaning around like being a black person that I'm now trying to decipher and like pull apart, and that's part of what the book is, you know. And that social meaning is like from centuries of like structural discrimination. But you know, there have been times in my life that I'm like, I resent having to live through that social meaning. You know, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates like writes this beautifully, like being born into this body and then, oh my God, like, and you know, I know that sometimes the term is contested, you know, the term white privilege, but the privilege of being born into a body that isn't like, you know, weighed down by that social meaning is that you never really, you don't have to contend with it. You know, I remember in the book I write about, you know, being aware, oh my God, I'm a black person at the age of like 4. And that was because I was like watching cartoons and stuff, and I realized, oh, the people with the skin color like mine, or they're not really the protagonist, you know, they might be a sidekick, or sometimes they might even be a baddie. And I was going to my mum with questions, and so to some extent I do resent that it's externally imposed on me, but at the same time I'm like, well, we can't outrun it, we have to try and tackle it, you know.
It's, you know, it's your lived reality in a majority white country, because actually, you know, we're both of Nigerian heritage. In Nigeria, that's not an issue because everybody's the same. And, you know, I am somebody who is biracial, and actually, but I could never identify as white, because if I were to say to you, actually, I'm not white, and I wrote about this recently in a New Statesman piece. If I were to say to you, I'm not black, I'm white, and my mother's white, you'd think I'm nuts, right? Because I don't present as white. And I think it really kind of embodies one of the issues around race, is that it's how people see you. You know, if I was a really light-skinned mixed race person, I would probably be able to move through this world as a white person, but I'm not. So I move through this world as a black person. But actually, if I can identify as black, I should be able to identify as white.
And the thing is about like, the construction of race is completely illogical.
Of course,
but here we are, we're all living with it because we're weighed down by it, we live through it, our society is organized around it, it's a social construct, not unlike money or time, and those were created by people too. So we live with the weight of it, even though like we know it's illogical, and yet it's very frustrating. And you know, I mean, scholars before me have written about this.
Yeah, I kind of accept it and celebrate it, to be honest, at this stage, because it's not something you can fight. And I actually feel also with like the battle against racism, it's something that one has to enjoy, you know, and I enjoy through my creativity in all the different, I'm not writing about racism, I'm writing about characters, but in all the different ways in which I can make an intervention through my creativity, I will do that. And it will do so. I'll do it in such a way that it will give me pleasure, because otherwise I would be living in pain, and I'm not prepared to do that.
I also love the fact that, but thank you for both, but that you're both proud. I get the discussion we just had, but it's really important because of my next question. One of the things I believe in is you can't beat it if you can't see it. And the great thing is you're both successful, and you're proud to be Black Londoners. And the next question is from Chantel, and she says, what advice would you give to young black teens, youth, interested in getting their voices heard? It's a really
how though?
interesting
In what
question,
way?
isn't it?
In what way do they want their voices heard?
Well, I think there is this view that many people are nervous about coming forward. The youth have been demonised. If you're a black young person, demonised and some. But you've got views you want to get across, and there is this, you know, there's an opportunity through social media. You mentioned the reach you've got, but also there's opportunities that you've provided. I mean, you talk all the time about the shoulders of giants and stuff, and so, you know, what advice do you give a young person who wants to write, who is an activist or wants to be a teacher or an author in relation to being heard?
I think one of the most important things, if you're coming from a community and you're considered to be a minority, is to develop your self-confidence. And actually, this is something that I did in my 30s. I went on lots of personal development courses where you learn how to believe in yourself and you claim your power and have ambitious goals and strive towards achieving those goals. Because if you're coming from certain backgrounds, that's not you're not inculcated with that at all. You know, you're told to shut up and to aim low, and you're not going to achieve, and you know that's your status in life. So with the young people who want to achieve, whether that is in politics or whatever profession or through their creativity, and they feel they need the confidence to do that, then actually, especially online now, they can go, I mean, especially with Americans, they can go onto these websites and read the books that will actually help them claim their power and give them the confidence and the vision and the determination and the self-motivation, help them with all of that to go out there and achieve whatever it is they want to achieve.
Ready?
Yeah, definitely. I would say first off, be prepared to be unpopular. Just be prepared. I think, you know, do your research. That's really important, especially in this age of misinformation. That, you know, if we were going to, you know, stick our heads over the parapet, let's make sure we're speaking from a place of, you know, fact and truth. And what else would I say? I mean, I definitely agree with Bernardine. Like, so I spent the majority of my childhood in Tottenham, in like northeast London, and like there was nobody like from a similar background from me, or like from like my immediate surroundings who were authors. I remember when I was in like secondary school and sixth form, the things I was really interested in were like philosophy, ethics, English literature, and you know, I was told like by members of my family, okay, well, how are you going to earn a living from, you know, being interested in philosophy and ethics, you know, like, and now I think about how those subjects that I took at the time, they absolutely inform my work, absolutely. Thinking about ethics, you know, deconstructing, you know, pieces of literature, absolutely inform my work. And I sometimes think to myself, if I'd listened to, you know, almost like discouraging statements, even though I think, you know, and I think a lot of us from like, you know, like second or third generation, like immigrants, like our parents are very concerned with us not struggling first and foremost, and it comes almost at the expense of like even following your dreams. So I'm not saying that I was told these things to be told don't follow your dreams, but it was like, Reni, please go out and do something that gives you a strong foundation in the world first before you try and do anything. But yeah, I sometimes think if I'd listened to that, I maybe wouldn't be where I am now, but I would say that where I am now is through being unpopular for a long time, for a good few years there.
Well, listen, enjoy this, the popularity wave that you're on. Can I just thank Reni, Bernardine, thank you so much. It's a really, I think, good point to end on, because I think both of you have shown you're at the top of your game, but the work ethic is just impressive. And what I always say to young people is you've got to work hard. And I think both your answers to the last question shows the fruits of the hard work, but also what you both said is, although Black History Month may end in a few days, we need to spend all year round celebrating Black success, but also educating or re-educating ourselves about some of the Black people upon whose shoulders you've both stood and who are responsible for London being the greatest city in the world. And as the Mayor of London, can I say how proud I am of both of you as Londoners who are at the top of your game, and the ripples of success are felt all around the globe. Thank you so much.
Well, we're proud of you too.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank
Cheers.
you.